Hello and welcome to Psych Boost. In this video we'll be talking about the cognitive approach to explaining depression. So some of the ideas we'll be discussing are Beck's cognitive theory, self-schemas, the ABC model by Ellis, and I'll give you terms like negative triad, information processing, and I'll link to the cognitive approach. Once we've done all that, we'll talk about some evaluation studies and some other evaluations that we can have on the cognitive approach to explaining depression. Firstly, disturbances in thinking. When we take the cognitive approach, we're going to be suggesting that the psychopathology, in this case depression, is going to come from problems with information processing. So this means our thinking, our cognitions are in some way broken. When we consider an event, we'll always think of it in a negative light. So if you remember from my cognitive psychology video, cognitive psychologists have got a term called a schema. In the video, I described a schema as a mental framework for objects that we use as kind of a shortcut in life. It's a way of quickly understanding the world that doesn't take too much energy. So in the cognitive video, I talked about a schema for a chair, for example. You don't need to think too much when you see a chair. Your schema includes that it can be sat on, that it'll bear your weight. Now, schemas also include schemas about ourselves. We have mental shortcuts in thinking about what our strengths and weaknesses are. Now, if we have inherently negative self-schemas, if we have negative ways of seeing ourselves, cognitive psychologists will suggest this will lead to depression. So some examples of negative self-schemas are, I've never been popular, or I'm just too disorganized, or I know I'm not creative enough to do that. And you can see how these negative schemas would lead on to behaviors that weren't helpful for the individual. The first one, for example, might stop them going to a party. The second one might stop them starting a business. And the third one might stop them doing anything creative at all. So based on this idea of a schema, Beck created the negative triad. Beck says that events will be seen with a very negative bias, and this is because the development of a range of negative schemas about yourself, but also about the world and the people in them, and also negative schemas about what's going to happen in the future. So this is going to lead to a range of different problems. One problem is overgeneralization. Let's say you have a bad experience in class, and then you develop the perspective that any class is going to be unpleasant for you. Also might lead to the magnification of problems. Maybe accidentally you bumped into somebody's car, you felt you upset them, and you can't stop thinking about this issue. And selective perception. So this is focusing right in on the negative aspects. Let's say you get a report from school and 9 out of 10 of them are glowingly positive. But there's one subject in which you got a really negative review in. And this is a subject that you really focus your attention on. Seeing the whole report as a disaster just because there's one negative review. And you can link this to absolutist thinking. So you said, well, my report isn't good unless every single subject on that report card gives me a positive review. So you might want to think of examples of negative views about the world, negative views about the future, and negative views about oneself that there could be. Onto something called the ABC model. Now, Albert Ellis understood that people go through life and they have certain events which are challenging. But he noticed that different people respond in different ways to these same events. And that ultimately resulted in a different consequence from that event for each person. So he broke it down into A, B, C. A is the activating event. So this is some external situation in which there's going to be a reaction to. Maybe it's failing a test. B is the belief. When we have an activating event, we think about what just happened. And we'll have a belief about why A happened. Now, according to Ellis, this could be rational or irrational. A rational belief about failing a test could be, oh well, everybody fails a test once in a while. I clearly didn't revise for it properly or well enough. I'll try harder next time and I'll pass the test. An irrational belief might be, well, I'm fairly sure the teacher's out to get me. The school don't really want me to pass anyway. Now you can see both of these beliefs will lead on to very different consequences. There'll be certain emotions felt from each belief, and there'll be certain behaviours that are going to be expressed as a result of it. So the rational belief of, maybe I just didn't revise hard enough, would lead not necessarily to a happy emotion, but certainly not misery, certainly not depression, and would probably lead to the behaviour of revising harder for the next test and passing. The irrational belief is, oh, my teachers don't like me, they're out to get me, is going to lead to quite negative emotions and potentially a behaviour such as leaving school. Ellis also has the term masturbatory thinking. Ellis suggests one of the reasons that we have depression is because we believe that the world owes us. We believe the world should be a certain way. And if it's not, we're not happy. So the world must be perfect, or maybe more relatably, I must get an A on this test. It must not rain on my wedding day, otherwise it's ruined. If we believe in musts, and musts can't always happen, and the world doesn't always turn out the way we want it to be, this is clearly going to lead to disappointment and unhappiness. So let's look at some evaluations for this section. Psychologists Hammond and Krantz did find support for cognitive negative distortions. They looked at depressed and non-depressed female undergraduates, and they gave them a short story. Now what they found was that the depressed females would go on to show more errors in logic when interpreting the narrative than those females without depression, suggesting they're distorting the story with a negative bias. A good advantage to the cognitive explanation is it's actually gone on to make a really successful and really widely used psychological therapy called CBT. There is strong evidence that these treatments are successful. For example, March in 2007 compared to cognitive behavioral therapy with medication. What March found was an effectiveness rate of 81% for both treatments. Now what it suggests is the underlying cognitive theory that depression might be due to faulty cognitions is valid if the treatment based on that is effective. However, while the cognitive explanation can explain most depressed patients, it can't really explain manic depressives. So this is when some people with depression show a large amount of energy and confidence in short bursts before returning to a depressive state. It's hard to explain this from the perspective of broken schemas, because it would seem their schemas would switch quite quickly. Also, a lot of patients have really significant anger management problems, which also can't really be explained too well by the cognitive explanation. Another point is, this explanation for depression, a cognitive explanation, can do one of two things. We could argue that maybe it hands responsibility into the hands of the patients. It maybe empowers them to go and change and help themselves. This could be seen as a positive. But it could also be a case of potentially blaming the victim. If you say depression is a biological factor, then it's outside the control of the individual to change it. It's not their fault. But if you suggest that depression is a problem in the way that they think, you're potentially blaming the victim, suggesting maybe it's their fault for feeling as they do. Now this could especially be a problem if there are certain environmental factors which are leading to the depression, such as someone going through the grieving process or struggling with extreme poverty. The evaluation by March did show an 81% success rate for CBT, but it also found it for medication as well. So there is considerable evidence that biological factors play a role in depression. Some people seem to be genetically vulnerable. If your parents suffer from extreme depression, you're more likely to yourself. And because antidepressant medication is successful, perhaps there's a neurochemical factor involved in its expression. So this means the cognitive explanation can't be a full explanation of what depression is. I really hope you found this video useful in studying psychology. 3 things help this channel grow a lot: likes, comments and subscriptions. Thank you so much if you've done any of those things for this video.